My name is Leith Martin, and I run what's called the Trost Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. I've been there about 6 years, and Bill and Jeff have asked me to talk about due diligence. I will move quickly, so if you have a question, please ask, because I'm going to try to compress a little time and get you closer to schedule. But if you have a question, please ask. So due diligence is the process or the investigational process that helps you figure out whether or not you want to make an investment in the company, right? So lots of the information that you might get in this due diligence process is the information that you might use to help figure out your valuation, right? One of the most interesting things to me about valuation is oftentimes when I meet with entrepreneurs, as Bill mentioned, sometimes they're irrationally exuberant in terms of their valuation. The reality is that the value of a company is only worth what people are willing to pay you for it. It's not worth more or less. It's worth what people are willing to invest in the business for. And if you feel like they're not willing to invest at that number and you keep looking and 6 months later you're still looking and can't find anyone, that means the problem's probably you, okay? So don't think it's the investors that don't know what they're doing. It is irrelevant whether they know what they're doing or not. If they're not willing to invest, the number's not right. So we're going to talk a lot about due diligence today. Now, why is due diligence incredibly important? If you look at these numbers right here, it gives you some idea of the sophistication or the reality or the risk associated with investing in a startup, right? So if you look at these numbers, and these aren't exactly the same criteria that Bill listed, but they're not far off, right? In terms of the team and the market demand and production and things like this. If they get a 9 out of 10 on every one of these rankings, the likelihood they're going to succeed is a coin flip, right? When you actually do the statistics, basically it's a coin flip on whether or not going to be successful. If one of these is you rank as, say, a 50%, right? So it's a 5 out of 10, then the likelihood or probability of success falls to 27%, right? So the reality is that due diligence is incredibly important. And so if you don't spend as much time as getting comfortable with the deal, I will tell you that I think the reality is you're never going to be 100% comfortable with the deal. The truth is how uncomfortable are you with the things that you don't like? But this is why due diligence is incredibly important. It's why it's something you should be doing as an investor. So when should you do due diligence? Now, listen, oftentimes the reality is that you don't get caught as an investor. Sometimes you get caught in these weird cycles, right? So you're like, well, I set a goal at the beginning of the year that I'm going to invest $1 million in early stage companies by the end of the year. It's December. I have 500K left. What's in the room, right? It's like being at the bar at the end of the night and the last person in, you're like, well, that's going to be my day because everyone else is left, right? So the reality is if you're going to do due diligence, or if you're going to actually move to due diligence on a deal, make sure it meets your initial criteria or don't do it. Right? So these are some of the criteria that you may have. Like some people are industry specific. I only invest in SaaS. Or some people are, I only invest in pre-money or post-money. Whatever those criteria are that you set up for yourself when you decided you were going to be an investor, make sure that the deal meets those criteria before you proceed, because the reality is, if not, you get caught into these cycles of needing to do a deal. And if you need to do a deal, you typically do a bad deal. Okay, so make sure that they meet your criteria before you actually move into due diligence. Invalid reasons of doing a deal or moving forward to due diligence is it's what's left in the room, right? And I have some money that I need to invest. If those are your criteria, then you should not probably be looking at the deal. So make sure it meets your criteria before you go to due diligence. All right, so how does this work? Oftentimes what happens is, Bill mentioned briefly when I asked my question, oftentimes what happens is that sometimes there's a lead person or a lead investor or a lead group in some particular cases that has basically gone out and they performed some of that due diligence. And they be what's called a trusted lead, right? So they've gone out and done some of that work. Are they willing to share their package with you, right? So have they done due diligence? Have they put together a report? And are they willing to share that information with you? Okay, so if they're not willing to share that information with you, there's usually a reason they're not willing to share it with you, right? But usually a lead investor wants other investors to participate. They might not want you to participate. Maybe they don't like you or something, so they won't give you their package. But the reality is that they oftentimes want to close the round, right? They want to increase the likelihood of success in the deal. So oftentimes somebody that's leading that round or making the initial due diligence is willing to share that information with other potential investors. I'll never forget, actually it was Bill Bott said something one time, and we were talking about a deal one time, And I can't remember what the number was they were trying to raise, but let's say they were trying to raise 200K, and the group of investors were like, well, I think we're just only going to make an investment of 100,000. And Bill made the comment, if you want to increase the likelihood to succeed, they won't succeed. Give them less money than they need to be successful, right? Guaranteed, just throw the bad money in there. So the reality is that the lead investors wants this deal to succeed because they've already put their money in, right? So are they willing to share their information? Sometimes this is done by an outside law firm. Sometimes the due diligence committee that's involved in an angel group might do this due diligence. Keep in mind, this is a two-way due diligence process. As an investor, you should assume the entrepreneur should be doing some due diligence on you as well, right? They may call other portfolio companies or ask you about portfolio companies you've made investments in because they want to find out if you're an ass or not, right? How much of a problem is it to deal with you as an investor as well? Sometimes people hire professional firms and consultants to do the due diligence. And listen, I'll tell you that to me, that's the least effective. And the reason I say that's the least effective, it's almost like entrepreneurs routinely contact me at the business school and they say, hey, do we have some business students that can write my business plan? And I typically say, well, let's take the least experienced individual. Let's ask them to write a business plan that you're going to spend the next 3 or 4 years of your life on. You're going to put your own time, your money, and efforts into it, and let them write your business plan, and you've disconnected from the entire process. The same is true of investing. You need to be involved in that process. And if you hire an outside firm to do 100% of that, more than likely, that firm's not going to be conscientious, maybe not the right word, but maybe they're not going to be, the things that are important to you may not be important to them, right? So you need to be involved in the process. You might do it yourself. Do you sign an NDA? The short answer is no, right? I've seen situations where there have been some unusual circumstances that maybe have an NDA signed. Every entrepreneur thinks their situation is unusual and you should have to sign an NDA to participate in looking at their deal. I would say in general, as an investor, especially early stage, just say no. And if an NDA is required in order to see the deal, just say, I'm sorry, we probably won't participate. When someone sees me or comes to talk to me and said, look, I want to talk to you about something I'm working on, we have to sign an NDA. I usually say the only thing I know for sure is that you're going to not be successful. And I haven't even seen the deal. And usually they get offensive. They're, how can you say that? And I said, because you can't get an investor because you're going to require an NDA. You can't even find a business partner or some other people to join the company because you make them sign an NDA to be involved. And more than likely, you're not even going to be able to get a customer because you're so worried about the way the process works. And the truth is I live in a world that's very different than most people. I don't live in the world of the attorney. I live in the world of the entrepreneur. And the reality is it's about execution. And if you're not capable of executing, it's irrelevant whether or not I've signed an NDA. And if you look at it from your standpoint as an investor, the truth is what if a better deal comes along in the same industry in 6 months and you should have made an investment in that deal, but you couldn't because you signed an NDA and now you limited yourself in terms of opportunity. So in my opinion, don't sign an NDA. And investors should shoulder the cost. An entrepreneur should not pay for you or pay for someone that you want to do the due diligence. You pay for that as the investor. So I've seen some situations. It's funny because I deal with some university-based technologies on occasion where there's assumptions that the sophistication of the science and other things are reasons that NDA should be signed. I typically think that you can provide a great deal of information without getting into secret sauce most of the time. That makes it easier to do a deal without an NDA in place, where a lot of times people say, they don't care to know what percentage of each polymer is involved in the process. They just want to know that the polymer works, right? Because we want to understand that anyway. There are times when I've seen a smaller company and a big customer that might be involved, maybe the federal government or something like that, that maybe there might be some concerns about NDAs because of the type of customer that's involved. But what about you, Bill? I will tell you that in general, I say don't sign an NDA.
I think the only time I've signed is just when I rewrote the NDA to only include what I thought was totally proprietary, right, and I didn't have a right to it.
Right.
And if that was acceptable to the entrepreneur, that was much more.
Right.
Yeah. And I think I'm in the same place as Bill. Every once in a while, you'll have a really specific, very technical thing or you'll want to go on a site visit and their plant or
Right.
whatever has some secret
Right.
stuff in there that they've signed NDAs on, so they can't show it to you
Right.
unless you're on the same team with them. But I mean, that's like 1 out of 100.
Right. And also
or
it's
if you want to
normally-
see the tech, if
Yeah.
they're about to apply for a patent and
Right.
they haven't applied for the patent yet, that's very sensitive. So, it'd be like, you know what, do I need to know
Right.
this? It's like,
You don't have to show me that.
right. It's
Yeah.
like, I can just taste the cookie. I don't need to
Right.
know the recipe.
Right. Right. And then also to that point, the reality is many times those deals are probably beyond Angel typically, right? Because if you've got manufacturing facilities or something's a little more sophisticated, then sometimes it might be a little later in the deal process. All right. So the type of things that you're looking for in terms of your team in your due diligence, right? So the things that you're looking for are credentials, right? So do they have the credentials, but theoretically, do they have the credentials necessary to do something like this? The truth is credentials aren't required, but there's something that maybe adds a little bit of comfort there, right? So, do they have a background in engineering? Do they have accreditation in engineering? Whatever those things may be that make you feel more comfortable. In some cases, I've seen background checks done on individuals. They're typically relatively inexpensive. Some way, maybe it might provide some additional information. Some of these things are things that are they necessary every time? Maybe or maybe not. But the reality is if you don't do it and it's relatively inexpensive to do and it bites you later, then you might wish that you would have done it. What's the mindset of the entrepreneur or the team itself? What is their leadership ability? Are they honest and do they have integrity? I think in terms of mindset, the thing I'm looking for here is oftentimes coachability is sometimes incredibly important, right? So do they only know what's right and no one else knows? Then that's usually a problem. There was actually a company that an investment group out of Australia that reached out to me one time, and they did a lot of gaming deals. And the reason they reached out to me is obviously we were in Vegas. And he told me they never invested in a second-time founder. In other words, if I started a company, I was incredibly successful the first time. This was my second company. They were out. He said, that's our policy. We don't invest the second time if they were successful the first time. And I said, why is that? He said, because almost every time they fail, because they think they know everything because they were successful in their first and only time. He said, so usually the third time, if they've got one failure under the belt, we're okay. But if they've got no failures under the belt, we don't invest. I thought that was an interesting category or criteria they used. Do they have intelligence? Goes without saying. And do they have generally good judgment, right? Entrepreneurship is really about having incomplete information and making decisions with that incomplete information in order to be able to move forward. And they have good judgment in their ability to be able to do that. All right, next, what is their business model, right? So do they have a meaningful value proposition? What does the distribution look like? Oftentimes I see deals where the distribution channels are incredibly complicated. Maybe those distribution channels are locked up by a relatively few number of suppliers, or maybe the customers are massive and to get access to that customer through distribution sometimes is a bottleneck. So sometimes distribution, I think, is under ranked in terms of the sophistication or the complexity of the likelihood of success of a deal. Is there differentiation between them and other opportunities in the marketplace? Are they different than other deals? Do they have a meaningful and well-defined growth strategy? And do you ultimately believe in that growth strategy? Are they going to grow through acquisition? Or are they going to basically just acquire customers online? What's their growth strategy look like? Do they have recurring revenue, obviously, right? So do they have to go kill or find a new customer every time for additional revenue? Or do some existing customers generate sub-residual revenue that make it a little easier to sustain the business long-term as opposed to having to find a new customer? So the cost of customer acquisition may be lower in that particular case. What's the capital requirements, right? So sometimes I've seen deals that I'm like, this is a game changer, but the reality is you need $150 million to even get started. Maybe because of the complexity of the manufacturing, the uniqueness of the type of manufacturing, or the access to the market in terms of credibility to be able to do business with a lot of these large customers. I read an article the other day that talked about all the deals. It's not exactly related, but I think it shows relevance. I saw a thing the other day that Google has an individual that basically is responsible for working with all the CEOs or managers that are working on all these unusual projects. And they routinely kill deals that are $100 million opportunities because they're not big enough to be relevant, right? And so sometimes when you're trying to access a market or an industry, a customer, can you raise enough money to become relevant in that market, right? So sometimes that's a concern. And then finally, what is your exit strategy? Well, all right, so what's the deal structure look like? That's obviously sometimes a concern. Those are the definitely something that Bill covered in terms of the things that you're kind of looking at. You know, Bill talked a little bit about safes. I think safes are much more common, but for a while, culturally, people were uncomfortable doing deals with safes because the reality were it was different than convertible note. It is just a contract. It's not actually a form of debt, even though convertible note is debt, but the reality is it doesn't have a lot of teeth, but it's something people were a lot more comfortable with. So what does the deal structure look like in terms of valuation? How much money have they raised? How much money do they have to raise? What do they have allocated already? And then finally, the exit strategy. And what I find interesting about exit strategy is absolutely no one in the room in any way agrees that you know what your exit strategy actually is. They do not believe that you can adequately predict in 7 years what's going to happen to this deal. The market will be incredibly different. You will be incredibly different. Your company will be incredibly different. Everything will be different in 7 years. It'll be different in 3 years. But the reality is, if you don't talk about exit strategy, then investors are uncomfortable, right? So if you meet with an entrepreneur and they don't have an exit strategy, that makes you uncomfortable because wait, I just want to make sure you know I expect to get my money back at some point, right? And so if someone doesn't have an exit strategy, then I would ask questions about that. So at least understand or make it clear that this is an investment that you hope to make, that they make the money. All right, so other things that we look at are things like financial projections. Do they have realistic assumptions? If they've done a good financial plan, they should have a list of assumptions, right? On the types of things that they're assuming. The 1% market share thing, that, you know, so entrepreneurs oftentimes like to make their market massive. Why? Because it makes them feel better. And the reality is they can just get 1% of the market and make their business work. The only thing I know for sure about a startup is you never have enough money and you never have enough people. And the likelihood that you're going to be able to market to 175 million every American male is zero, right? It's probably much more likely that your first customer is going to be some subset of that group, and you better focus more specifically on that. Now, just be careful. There are certain, I would say, tells, or in poker, you'd say somebody has a tell. There are certain things that investors or seasoned entrepreneurs pick up from inexperienced entrepreneurs. And one of those is, all I need is access to 1% of the market. Because every investor that's done lots of deals are like, here we go again, right? And so it shows the lack of experience. So you just want to make sure that those are the kind of things that you look out for. All right, so the next is cash flow timing. I was talking to a buddy of mine the other day that has a deal, as a company that he's put money in. And he's like, of course, they're going to run out of money, or they're going to need a raise between November 1st and January 31st. And in the world of investing, the reality is that it's really hard to close money in November to January, because when the holidays come, no one makes any decisions. No one gets back to anything till after the 1st. It's going to take another 30 days. And so what does the market timing look in terms of cash flow? When are they going to need the money? Do they have reasonable expenses, right? So it's a startup. They shouldn't be starving, meaning that they're literally not going to make it and they're going to have to shut the business down because they're going to lose their home. But the reality is they should be probably working for less than market value too, because it is a startup, right? So are the expenses reasonable for the business? Same thing on market salaries and equity. Are the margins incredibly slim? Financial projections are financial projections, right? What are projections? They're guesses. They're intelligent guesses. Theoretically, they should be based on some assumptions that have validity, but the reality is they're guesses. And if I put in my financial projections that I'm going to make 5%, the likelihood is I'm going to make negative 40%, right? So if a business model is built such that the margins are incredibly thin, especially at an early stage startup, especially one that I'm putting together projections for, and I'm only showing a 5% margin, then do not invest in that deal, right? Because even if they hit those numbers, it's irrelevant. It's not a deal that you want to be involved in, right? You're never going to get out of that deal. What does the balance sheet look like? What does the cash management look like? The other thing is yeah. Okay. Like the cash management. So financial casualness sometimes is the word I use. You know, if you look at a financial set of financial projections and there's mistakes in them, or lots of other issues, that should be a big red flag. Because this should be the thing you spend a significant amount of time on. Well, I mean, it's like nothing, it's like everything else, right? So what is the market for that? So if I'm a software person, and I can demand in a market 200K and I'm paying myself 75. Okay, that or 100, that should be relatively reasonable. But at the same time, am I an owner? Because if I'm an owner, I may expect a little more pain than someone that I've just brought in as an individual who might have some sort of, earn out or some sort of vesting schedule or something to come on as an early employee. But, below market for sure. What below market depends, right? Good question. All right. And the other thing is, are you comfortable with the number, right? Whatever they're paying themselves. If there's a really fine line when it comes to supporting the entrepreneur between comfort and discomfort, right? Too much discomfort, the business fails. Too much comfort, the business fails. And it is subjective, right? That's exactly right. You want to be motivated. And the same is true in terms of valuation. I've seen individuals take a lower valuation because of the type of investor that's in, but I've also seen investors demotivate founders because they've pounded them on valuation, and then now they're demotivated. And so what have you done? You've thrown money into a sinking ship because, by the way, you're the one that pulled the plug out of the bottom, right? So there's a fine line between that. All right. So what are the other things that you should be looking for? So what are your general impressions? There's lots of terms, I guess is the right word, or sayings that exist, and you start thinking about them. They're really common in language. But oftentimes we say, what's your gut feel, right? So what are your impressions about the deal? Is there something you're uncomfortable with? I will tell you that myself, there have been lots of times in my own career where I've seen opportunities or situations and I've been like, man, I don't understand it. If I don't understand it, I think something's wrong. And usually in a year or two, it bears itself out. And I'm like, oh, that's why there was something wrong with that deal. So your general impressions sometimes matter. What's the culture of the organization? Do they work well together? It's so fascinating. I brought in a speaker one time in one of my classes, and he was basically the CTO of Switch when they were had 4 employees or something like that, right? Before they ever got the Enron building, before they ever built SuperNap 1, this is like when they were in the strip mall and had a data center next to like a hair salon and something else, right? And he came and talked about what life was like then, whatever. And it's funny because when he left, I had a student that said, I was actually a security guard. Recently had left the military. I was a security guard for them. And I was like employee number 7. He said, obviously I should have stayed, but I didn't. But he was telling me, he said, you should have heard, like they were screaming at each other because well, they don't know where they're going to get the money to pay the power bill, right? In the early days. So what is the culture like inside the organization in order to be able to potentially be successful? Talk to the employees, if they have employees, and you get the opportunity to talk to employees, talk to the employees. Ask for references. They're going to give you the best references, right? So if you call one of their references and they're not very keen, then that's a red flag that there's something really significant going on there. Next, talk to customers if you can, if they have customers. Just call them up and find out their experiences. Listen, one of the most interesting things in business that I've noticed over the years is that we have, in general, this fear of rejection in every aspect of our life, right? We don't want to be rejected in our personal life, we reject in business. But the reality is if you should be prepared to be told no. And if you pick up the phone and call one and say, hey, I'm just calling to learn something about a business that's basically you're one of their customers. Is anyone willing to talk to me about it? If they say no, what does it hurt, right? Just move on. But it helps to get that information. Talk to other investors. Find out what it's like working with them. Do you get regular updates? What has the relationship been like for you as an investor inside the company? Talk to the other advisors if there are other advisors in the company, or who are those advisors? Are they credible? Do they make you comfortable in the deal, more or less? What do the competitors look like in the marketplace, right? And then finally, what's valuation and what does it look like? Are you comfortable with the valuation? Is it relevant or is it comparable to other valuations? What does it look like in that regard as well? All right. So you get to this point at some point, and I think Maggie has the FundNV checklist. If you'll just make sure to include that, perfect. There's a great checklist on due diligence that you can go through that has a list of lots of different things that you can check and score them and ultimately figure out whether or not you may want to make an investment. But ultimately, at some point, you've gone through this process, and at the very end, you're yes or no, right? Do you still believe that the company can pull it off based on the information that you gathered during the course of this? No deal is perfect, and that's the truth. The reality is every deal, if a deal is incredibly perfect, there's a pretty good chance they don't need your money, because they could probably raise it lots of other ways. They might be able to raise it with debt. They might be able to do something else and put the deal together. They might be able to get it all from one individual and not have to go raise it from lots of different people. So every deal is going to have problems. The question is, how comfortable are you with those problems? And do you feel like that they can overcome those? Some of them may be market, some of it may be the team. I'll tell you that if it's the team, I would be the most uncomfortable with that. Market conditions do change, and that's incredibly important, but a good team sometimes can make some pivots based on market conditions. Do you feel that you provide value? I've seen situations where investors only invest in deals because they feel like they can help the company. Why? Because they think it dramatically increases the likelihood that their investment's going to be successful. For example, I was the ex-CTO at AT&T, and as a result of that, I know everything about the telecommunications industry, and I think you guys are onto something. I can invest in the deal, but I can also help ensure my deal becomes more valuable because I can make introductions, or I can help you with strategy or other things to help move the deal forward, okay? Know yourself and your group. So what I mean by that is that if the amount is outside your comfort zone, don't put yourself in a situation where you're, listen, the likelihood of success is obviously pretty low, right? And so you don't want to invest in a deal that if it doesn't hit, the cards start to crumble, and the next thing you know, you're in trouble, right? So, and also know the group or organization that you're working with, if it's with an angel group or whatever. And don't look at deals or be involved in deals that you think are too big, too outside of your comfort zone, or even outside industries or different types of things that you're not gonna do, right? And then finally, have a process ultimately to decide, right? If you're in a larger group, then that process may be, okay, we're all voting, who's in? Great, let's make an investment. If you're an individual, it may be that checklist that you've got from us or someone else, and you've gone through that checklist and you say, I'm gonna invest in everything over an 80, whatever the number is. Great, I got to an 80, am I still comfortable? Then okay, I have a process to use to decide. So listen, I think that, okay, so in the early stage of an investing opportunity, everyone involved should be on their best behavior. The investors should be on their best behavior, because the reality is that if you believe in this as an investment, you want them to take your money because you hope that they provide a return on investment. The entrepreneur should be on their best behavior, because the reality is that this is before the marriage. If things are rocky before the marriage, it's going to be a disaster after the marriage, right? And so that's one thing in terms of the relationships between the investor. But the other thing Bill talks about is coachability. I think that in general, entrepreneurs that know everything are oftentimes, especially in early stage business, incredibly dangerous. And they're dangerous in the sense that they're going to get hit by the bus and they didn't even see the bus coming. And so coachability can come from maybe their age, or maybe you're trying to talk to them and help them or mentor them in some way. But humility, I think, there's a fine line between humility and cockiness, I guess, right? And if you're incredibly cocky and you think you can't fail, then it's a bad combination. You have to have confidence in your ability to be able to do so, but you have to be careful. But then you also have to be willing to take advice, because that advice can be incredibly important. You have to be, your investors didn't give you the money hoping that you would fail. So you have to believe that they're going to be, they're going to do their best to help you, right? They don't want you to fail because they don't want their money to go to zero, right? And so coachability is incredibly important. But I've also seen situations where I tell people all the time that if you have an investor that you can't stand, but yet they're willing to write a check, you better not take their money, because the truth is it just gets worse once the investment is made. So, sometimes I've seen investors come to me and say, well, they're not coachable. And I'm like, well, you're a punk. I mean, I don't know, sure I would listen to you either, right? So it goes both ways. But in terms of coachability, you as an investor, you need to find someone that strikes this balance between coachability and confidence, because those things are incredibly important. Either one is out of balance, meaning they're a complete pushover and they do everything you say, then the reality is that's probably not good. But on the other side of the equation, they don't listen to anyone. That's not good either, right? As always, everything's nuanced, right? All right, so let's talk about any questions about due diligence. Listen, Bill will tell you, this is the one thing no one wants to do. No one likes to do the due diligence. No one wants to be on the due diligence committee. No one volunteers for that. Why? Because you got to go through all these questions. It takes a lot of time. You expend a lot of individual time, but also political capital oftentimes, because you're calling people that maybe are somewhat connected to you, that you may need to get information about the deal from someone else, or you may have to find someone that's already invested in the deal and get a connection with someone that might connect you with them. But ultimately, if you don't do it, okay, so if you do everything perfectly, Angel Capital Association provided these statistics a long time ago. If you do everything perfectly and you invest in 10 deals, and let's make the math easy, $100 in 10 deals, so you put $1 million to work, 5 of those companies are going to go out of business. Gone. $500,000 you put over here in the pile and you burned. All right. Of the 5 deals that are left, 2 become the walking dead. Basically, company survives, they pay their bills, they're never going to scale, you're never going to get your money back. Investors are getting much more sophisticated. Jeff was telling about clauses they have that basically allow them the opportunity at least to exit those type deals, right? So at least you can write them off. And then of the 3 that are left, 2 probably are going to get you maybe, hopefully, a 2 to 3 times return, which hopefully pays for your losses, and you hit a home run on 1 deal, right? So 10% of the deals actually return, hopefully, a 20+ return. And that's if you do everything correctly. You do the due diligence correctly, right? You didn't just willy-nilly pick 10, right? I think it was Bob, the attorney that was involved in the Sierra Angels one time. He says, every deal I'm doing, I hope is the 10th deal. And then I had a student ask me one time, and they were like, well, why are they picking 5 bad deals? They said, I said, they didn't think any of those deals are going to be bad. They thought they were all 20+ exits, right? So it has to be perfect.